How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom HaMishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Thursday? Paul in the Great Northwest, Melissa in Great Neck, Ohio, Shandora in the Bronx, Lucy, Minnesota, Yosef from New Jersey, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Jonathan in Ventura County, Alan in New York City. Welcome, everybody. Doubled off today, pages 147 and 148 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, making our way through chapter 9, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 7, which concerns a person who is on his deathbed and wrote a deed granting all his property to others. So if he reserves for himself any amount of that property, then even if he gets better, the gift that he made while on his deathbed stands. The gift is a gift, it's valid, the people who receive it received it. But if he reserves none of his property for himself, meaning that, and he then recovers, so now he's broke. He has no way to make a living. He gave everything away. So then we assume that he would not have given away all his property if he had known he was going to recover. And so if he reserved nothing for himself and he gets better, then the gift is not a gift. And whatever he gave away is retracted and he retains all of his property. That's what the Mishna said. We picked this up about a third of the way. A quarter of the way, maybe less, down page 147a. Unlike the gifts of a healthy person, the gifts of a person on his deathbed, right, gifts that he makes on his deathbed to others, do not require a formal act of acquisition, right? So just like yesterday we saw that a man who seems to be about to die or being taken away to his death by the Romans, he's imprisoned, he's going to be executed. So if he says, write a get for my wife, right? So normally if a man wants to divorce his wife, he has a get written up, but they're not divorced until he takes that get, that bill of divorce, and gives it to his wife. So normally, if a person says, write a get for my wife, he's not divorced because he won't be divorced until that get is written up and he hands it to her. But one who's about to die, we assume that he meant to say, write and give the get to my wife. So likewise, a person on his deathbed, when he makes a gift, the gift is acquired by the person who he's giving it to, assuming he didn't give away all of his property. Unlike a healthy person who says, give this property to so-and-so, but if that person, the recipient, doesn't make a formal act of acquisition, a kinyan, then he never acquired it, right? So it's another example of, the rabbis kind of easing the law a little bit in an extreme situation like a person on his deathbed, so that we can more often accomplish what is the obvious intention of that person on his deathbed, but he wasn't able to, execute in the way he normally would when he's healthy, but we want to honor his wishes, right? So unlike the gifts of a healthy person, the gifts of a person on his deathbed do not require the formal act of acquisition, the kinyan. Rabbi Zera says that Rav says, from where is it derived that this law with regard to the gift of a person on his deathbed is by Torah law? So we would say in Hebrew, doraisa or is that actually Aramaic? But doraisa means it is by Torah law, as opposed to derabanan, it is Aramaic, which means by rabbinic law, right? So is something written expressly, or even if it's not exactly expressly written in the Torah, we can derive it directly from the Torah, and therefore it is by Torah law, as opposed to something which is a rabbinic decree. Now, both of these are the law that we follow. But the difference between Torah law and rabbinic law is that if something is by Torah law, in a case of uncertainty, in a case of doubt, we rule stringently. Whereas if something is by rabbinic decree, in a case of doubt, we rule leniently, right? So if we're not sure exactly what happened, if it's by Torah law, we're going to be stringent. If by rabbinic decree, we're going to be lenient. So Rabbi Zera says that Rav says, how do we know that this law, this law, that a person on his deathbed who makes a gift, no kinyan is required for that gift to be acquired by the recipient? How do we know that this is by Torah law? As it is stated in the passage delineating the laws of inheritance. If a man dies and he does not have a son, then you shall cause his inheritance to pass to his daughter. Right? This is God's word in the Torah, Book of Numbers 27:8. So the term "you shall cause to pass," this is superfluous, as the verse could have stated, "his inheritance shall go to his daughter." One can therefore derive from this term that you have another case of causing property to pass to another, right? This is already an existing kind of conveyance that we use in the case of a man who doesn't have sons and leaves only a daughter, and so the inheritance goes to her. But since we're using this unusual language, it must be that this type of conveyance exists in some other context than a man who dies and leaves only a daughter and no son. And when else is this kind of conveyance used? It must be, when else, what is comparable to this case of inheritance, which does not require an active acquisition, right? When somebody inherits, they don't have to do a kinyan, they don't have to do a formal active acquisition in order to receive the inheritance. So where else do we see that? This is the case of the gift of a person on his deathbed. Now, what they're saying is we see in the Torah that there is some other situation where there is a conveyance, there's a gift that's not an inheritance or not a standard inheritance and does not require a kinyan. Does it say there that it's the case of a person making a gift on his deathbed? No. But what they're saying is there's no other comparable case, so it must be this particular case, that of a gift on a deathbed, and therefore, since there's no other situation where such a conveyance could be made, it must be that this particular conveyance that we're talking about is not just a rabbinic decree, but it is actually a Torah law. It has the force of Torah law. But Rav Nachman says that Rabba Bar Abu says the law with regard to the gift of a person on his deathbed is not derived from this conveyance or the language that's used in the case of inheritance passing to a daughter, which implies that there's some other similar conveyance. Rather, we derive it from here. Numbers 27:9, and if he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers, right? If there's no sons, you shall pass the property to his daughter. If there's no daughter, then you shall give it to the brothers, right? The man's brothers, if he leaves brothers. Now we go from it shall pass to his daughter. Now we're using a different verb. You shall give that inheritance to his brothers. Now the verse could have stated his inheritance shall go to his brothers, as inheritance is transferred by itself without any intervention. You don't need someone to step in and give it to the brothers. It's an inheritance. Now that the man died and he had no sons and he had no daughters, it simply goes to the brothers. Why does the Torah use the verb give? Who is giving? Right? Are you saying the court is giving? But the inheritance would pass to the brothers anyway because it says so in the Torah. So what do we learn from this superfluous verb to give? You shall give. One can therefore derive from the term you shall give that you have another case of giving that is comparable to this case. And what is this case? This is the case of a gift made on someone's deathbed. So the Gemara asks, and with regard to Rav Nachman, Rav Nachman in the second case was talking about the brothers. With regard to Rav Nachman, what is the reason that he did not say that this law can be derived from the term you shall cause to pass? In other words, why did Rav Nachman disagree when earlier, who said it? Rabbi Zera in the name of Rav, who said that we learn out that the gift of a person on his deathbed does not require a kinyan, that we learn that out from the part of the verse that talks about the inheritance of a daughter in the absence of sons. Why did Rav Nachman feel the need to say, basically, no, we don't derive it from there. Rather, we derive it from the case of giving to the brothers. So why did Rav Nachman not agree with the first two rabbis? So with regard to Rav Nachman, what is the reason that he did not say that this law can be derived from the term you shall cause to pass to the daughter? And the Gemara answers, Rav Nachman, he requires the verse for that which is taught by Rebbe, right? So he's going to use that teaching about you shall cause to pass to the daughter. He's going to learn a different teaching from that. Since he's learning a different teaching, that verse is not available to teach that the gift on the deathbed does not require a king and that it is by Torah law. That verse is not available, according to Rav Nachman, to teach that. Why? Because he requires it for that which is taught by Rebbe. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rebbe says, with regard to all of the heirs, the term giving was stated in the Torah. And here, with regard to the daughter, the term caused to pass or causing to pass was stated. So one can derive from this that there is no heir, H-E-I-R, no heir, who can cause one's inheritance to pass from one tribe to another tribe, except for the daughter, since her son and her husband inherit from her, and they may be of a different tribe, right? So if a man dies, he leaves no sons, but he has a daughter, she inherits his property, right? Including the ancestral field that's been passed down in his family when they're all living in the promised land. And so the ancestral fields that were allotted to the various tribes when the children of Israel entered the promised land, and it was all divvied out after the wars of conquest by Joshua in the book of Joshua. But if a man dies and leaves no son, so his property goes to his daughter. Now his daughter ought to marry, in that situation, a man from her father's tribe for this very reason, but she's not forced to do that. Therefore, if she marries a Jewish man from a different tribe, then she dies, right? So that land that was her father's, and let's say she came, her father was a member of the tribe of Benjamin, and then this daughter, marries a man from the tribe of Judah. Then when she dies, this field from her father's ancestral holdings in Benjamin now ends up being owned by a member of the tribe of Judah. And how do we know that this is possible? I.e., that she's not forced to marry a man from her father's tribe, and that she can marry a man from another tribe, even though this will cause the field to go from one tribe to another. How do we know that's possible? Because of this teaching of Rebbe, based on the language shall cause to pass. Now the Gemara asks, okay, that's why Rav Nachman didn't accept the teaching of Rabbi Zera. So now why doesn't Rabbi Zera accept the teaching of Rabbi Nachman? And with regard to Rabbi Zera, what is the reason that he did not say that this law about a deathbed gift is by Torah law, that it can be derived from the term, then you shall give? Why doesn't he agree with Rav Nachman? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Zera maintains that this usage is the usual manner of the verse, and one cannot derive anything from this term. He doesn't think it is free to derive meaning from it. He thinks that this is just the way the language of the Torah as humans understand it, and it's not available for a new teaching. Rab Menashe bar Yirmiyah says, the halacha, the law, with regard to the gift of a person on his deathbed, is derived from a totally different place, not from the Chumash, not from the 5 books of Moses, but rather from the 2nd book of Kings, much later in the Hebrew Bible, where it says, in those days, Hizkiyahu, or in English, Hezekiah, became deathly ill, and Isaiah ben Amoz, the prophet, came to him and said to him, so says the Lord, instruct your household, for you will die, and you will not live. 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 1. And this indicates that merely by issuing an instruction, a person on his deathbed can transfer ownership of his property. even though the recipient didn't perform a kinyan, didn't perform a formal act of acquisition, it's already understood legally to be his after the instruction. So why does that? Because he was on his deathbed. No kinyan is required. That shows you that it's at least from scripture, right? By biblical law and not just by rabbinic decree. Rami Bar Yecheskel says the halacha with regard to the gift of a person on his deathbed is derived from a different place, from here, from 2 Samuel 17:23. Quote, and when Achithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his ass, and he arose, went to his home, to his city, and he instructed his household, meaning he disposed of his possessions, and then strangled himself. And this indicates that merely by issuing an instruction, a person on his deathbed can transfer ownership of his property. And our sages taught before his death, when he saw that Absalom's rebellion against King David had failed, Achithophel instructed his sons with regard to 3 matters, right? Achithophel backed the wrong horse in the struggles for succession after King David. He thought Absalom would end up being the next monarch. Of course, it ended up being King Solomon. Because he backed the wrong guy, he knew that he was out and he wasn't just going to get fired. His life was in danger. So apparently he killed himself. But we can still learn a few things from Achithophel, because after all, he was a trusted advisor of David during David's lifetime. So he instructed his sons with regard to 3 matters. Do not be participants in a dispute. Good advice. If you don't have to get involved in somebody else's quarrel, don't. Very good advice. And do not rebel against the kingship of the house of David. Even better advice. And if the festival of Shavuos is a clear day, sow wheat, sow, S-O-W, right, plant wheat, as it is a sign that the wheat crop will thrive. Mar Zutra said it was stated that the wheat crop will thrive if Shavuos is a cloudy day, not if it is a clear day. And the sages of Nehardea say in the name of Rabbi Yaakov, according to both opinions, a clear day does not literally mean a clear day, nor does a cloudy day literally mean a cloudy day. Rather, even if the day is cloudy, but a north wind is blowing the clouds away, this is considered a clear day. Rabbi Abba said to Rav Ashi, we teach this matter of signs concerning crops with regard to the statement of Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. As Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi says, at the conclusion of the final day of Sukkot, right, the fall festival of Sukkot, everyone looked upon the smoke rising from the arrangement of wood on the altar. Right? So when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, there was an ever-present fire, an Eish Tamid, right? An ever-present fire on the altar where the sacrifices were brought. The Kohanim, the priests, would, light that fire in the morning every day and add wood to it. And then offerings that were burned on the altar were burned in this fire. And one of the miracles of the Holy Temple is that column of smoke would not, be scattered, that it would rise, even on windy days, quite straight and visible from a far distance. But apparently, even though it was miraculously rising straight, on this last day of Sukkot, sort of God would allow it to move a little bit one direction or another to give the people a sign of what's coming. And what were the signs? As Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi says, at the conclusion of the final day of the festival of Sukkot, everyone looked upon the smoke rising from the arrangement of wood on the altar. If the smoke inclined toward the north, this means that a south wind is blowing, right? When we say a south wind, it means a wind from the south blowing in the northerly direction. So if the smoke inclined toward the north, because of a south wind, so then the poor people were glad, and the homeowners, right, the landed people, if if it inclined toward the north, the poor were glad and the homeowners were sad, because this was a sign that the year's rainfall would be plentiful. Wait a minute. Yeah, because I just want to make sure I'm reading in the right place. Yeah, the poor were glad and the homeowners were sad, because this was a sign that the year's rainfall would be plentiful. And although the rain would produce an abundant crop, the produce would decay due to the humidity. The humidity would make it difficult to store the abundant harvest, forcing the homeowners to sell the produce quickly at a lower price, right? So the wind from the south means that moist air coming into Israel from the south, it's going to bring a lot of rain, but it's also going to bring humidity, and the large crop would rot quickly if it was stored, so they'd sell it at bargain basement prices. This was good for the poor and bad for the landowners. If the smoke inclined toward the south, because the wind was blowing from the north, the poor were sad and the homeowners were glad, because this indicated that the year's rainfall would be sparse and the produce would be meager, but it would store well. If the smoke inclined toward the east because of a west wind, everyone was glad, because this indicated that there would be enough rainfall to ensure a substantial crop, and at the same time the produce would store well, so it didn't have to be sold at bargain basement, but there would be plenty of it. If the smoke inclined toward the west because of an east wind, then everybody was sad, because the east wind does not bring rain, and this indicated that there would be a drought. Now, the Gemara raised a contradiction from a Baraisa. An east wind is always beneficial, and a west wind is always harmful. A north wind is beneficial to the wheat when it has reached 1/3 of its growth, and harmful to the olives when they are blossoming. And a south wind is harmful to the wheat when it has reached 1/3 of its growth, and beneficial to the olives when they are blossoming. And this contradicts what we heard just before. So Rav Yosef says, and some say it is Mar Zutra who says this, and some say it is Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak who says this. The following is your mnemonic to remember which wind is beneficial to which crop. The table, the shulchan, is in the north of the sanctuary. That's where the loaves of showbread were stored. And this is in the north side of the sanctuary. And the menorah, the candelabrum, is in the south. Now, this one increases on its own, and that one increases on its own. Meaning, the table upon which the showbread made from wheat is placed, this is in the north, and the north wind is beneficial to the wheat. The menorah, which is lit with olive oil, is in the south, and the south wind is beneficial to the olives. In any event, this Baraisa contradicts the statement of Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi with regard to the effect of the western and eastern winds. So is the western wind the wind that comes from the west? That sounds like it's good, right? It's coming from the ocean into Israel, brings moisture and rainfall. The east wind, meaning from the east into Israel, it's coming across the desert. That's the one that portends drought. So isn't that pretty clear? So why would you say that the west wind is harmful and the east wind is beneficial when it's just the opposite? And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult. La kasha. The east wind, is for us in Babylonia, right? Because the sages of the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, they're not living in the land of Israel. They're living in Bavel, which is part of the Persian Empire, modern day Iraq and Iran. And over there, a wind from the east is beneficial, whereas a wind from the west is harmful, the opposite of what it is in Israel. It is taught in a Baraisa. Abba Shaul says, if the festival of Shavuos is a clear day, this is a good sign for the entire year. Rav Zevid said, with regard to this first day of Rosh Hashanah, if it is warm, the entire year will be warm. But if it is cold, the entire year will be cold. Now, this is something, this idea that Rosh Hashanah sets the tone for the year. We also teach this spiritually. Right? If you bring your whole self spiritually into the preparation for Rosh Hashanah and the praying and singing and repentance, and examining of one's deeds on Rosh Hashanah, then you're setting a tone, you're setting, a precedent and a pattern for the whole year. That's perhaps why, right, Rosh Hashanah and that whole period, the days of awe and Yom Kippur and the first Shabbos that comes in between them, why those days are so important in the calendar, because they set the pace and the tone, what you can expect for the rest of the year. But about the weather, right? So again, in the Barais it says that Abba Shaul says that the festival of Shavuos is clear, good sign for the whole year. Rav Zeved said with regard to this first day of Rosh Hashanah, if it is warm, the year is warm, and if it is cold, the entire year will be cold. And the Gemara asks, what difference is there whether one knows this or not, right? What difference does it make? If it's warm on Rosh Hashanah, then you're saying it's going to be warm the whole year? Or if it's cold on Rosh Hashanah, it's going to be cold the whole year? You're like colder than normal or warmer than normal? What difference does it make whether you know that or not? The weather's going to be what the weather's going to be. We can't affect the weather. So what difference does it make whether one knows this? Now we're on page 147b. And the Gemara answers, the difference is with regard to the prayer of the high priest, who would pray on Yom Kippur for beneficial weather on behalf of the nation. And this knowledge enabled him to formulate his prayers accordingly. And the Gemara resumes the discussion with regard to the gifts of a person on his deathbed. By the way, so that was one person who could affect the weather, perhaps, if his prayers were accepted on behalf of the nation. But sadly, we don't have the Holy Temple anymore, nor a high priest. If we could all unite in praying for the same thing at the same time, perhaps God would really incline towards such a communal prayer of all the Jewish people. But what we don't have is a high priest who represents all of our interests in the Holy Temple. We don't have that anymore, sadly. Now we go back to our discussion of gifts being made on a deathbed. That was a digression. Okay. And Rava says that Rav Nachman says the law that the gift of a person on his deathbed does not require an active acquisition is merely by rabbinic law, right? So we heard several sages saying, well, this is how we know that the fact that a person making a gift on his deathbed that the recipient does not require a formal active acquisition, a kinyan, in order for the recipient to acquire such a gift. It's a done deal. How do we know that that's by Torah law? And a bunch of sages offered, how we know that, where we see that in Scripture, at least implied. But now here comes Rav in the name of Rav Nachman and says, no, it's not by Torah law. It is the law, but we have that law that the kinyan is not required by the recipient of a gift that somebody made while on their deathbed. It's not by Torah law. It's by rabbinic decree. So why were they trying to show that it's by Torah law? He says, no, it's merely by rabbinic law. But the sages instituted it lest the person on his deathbed see that his will is not being carried out and he lose control of his mind due to his grief, exacerbating his physical state. In other words, it was possibly to save a life. If a person is on his deathbed and he wants to give away his property and they're saying to him, well, listen, in order for this gift to be a valid gift, you're going to we have to write it down. We have to bring it, you can't write it yourself. I'm illiterate. We have to bring a scribe. And the scribe is not coming, and this person's getting agitated because they can't formalize that gift, then it's, maybe his unworthy child is going to inherit it, or his brother or his cousin who's the only living relative who he hates, and he's getting super agitated. And to save him from that trouble and to make sure that what he wants is going to happen, the sages enacted this decree. So it's not by Torah law. So why are we trying to say that it was by Torah law? And the answer is, as we're seeing here, is they gave it the strength of Torah law. Right? What I told you earlier, if something's by Torah law, then in a case of uncertainty, we rule stringently. If it's a rabbinic decree, in a case of uncertainty, we rule leniently. But here is a rabbinic decree that has the force of Torah law, where we would rule stringently in a case of uncertainty. The Gemara asks, and did Rav Nachman actually say this? But doesn't Rav Nachman say, even though Shmuel says that with regard to one who sells a promissory note to another, and then he forgives the debt is forgiven, and the note is nullified, which is pretty slippery, right? That is, let's repeat that. Shmuel says that with regard to one who sells a promissory note, right? So you owe me $100. And when I lent you the $100, we made a contract, right? We wrote a promissory note and you signed it, and I'm holding this promissory note. This note is evidence that you owe me $100. Or let's say you owe the owner of this promissory note, which is me, $100. But if I sell the promissory note to my buddy Tom over here, now you owe Tom $100 because he's holding the promissory note. Well, and let's say I'm not sure when you're going to pay. I'm not going to be able to force you to pay, so I'm like a little tired of it. So I said, I'll just sell it to Tom. Tom says, I think I can get him to pay. I'm like, I'm not sure you will. I'll sell it to you for $60. And Tom says, sure, I'll take it. So I got $60. Tom now is holding a note that says you owe him $100. Now, if I come along and say to you, hey, you know what? That $100 you owe me, you don't have to pay it. Now, I just screwed Tom for sure. But can I forgive this loan that you owe me after I sold the promissory note to Tom? Answer, according to Shmuel, yes, I can forgive the loan. Now, Tom is going to come to me and say, hey, I heard that you forgave that loan, that the $100 that was owed to you. And I say, yeah, I did. He says, but you sold me this promissory note for $60, understanding that I was going to go try and collect it for $100. I said, yeah, well, I felt bad for you, and so I forgave it. So Tom says, give me my $60 back. And of course, I owe Tom $60. But the point is that me forgiving the loan you owe me, even after I sold the promissory note to Tom, that forgiveness works. Now, why is that relevant? Let's keep reading. Even though Shmuel says that with regard to one who sells a promissory note to another and then forgives the debt is forgiven, and the note is nullified, and even the heir of the creditor can forgive the debt. Okay, the heir of a creditor. So now let's say you owe me $100. I have the promissory note. I don't sell it to Tom. I'm just holding this note. You owe me $100. I die, God forbid. My son, my heir, now you owe him $100. He's holding the promissory note. You owe it to him. Can my son forgive the debt? Sure, because now you owe it to him, and he stands in my shoes. So if I had the power to forgive the debt, he has the power to forgive the debt. Okay, so one who sells a promissory note to another and then forgives the debt is forgiven, and the note is nullified. And even the heir of the creditor, meaning the lender, can forgive the debt. Even though all of this is so, Shmuel concedes that if the creditor, right, the lender, me, gave the promissory note as the gift of a person on his deathbed. When I'm on my deathbed, I give the promissory note to Tom, okay? Then my heir cannot forgive the debt, right? I give this as a gift on my deathbed to Tom. Now, he's holding the promissory note. You owe him $100. Now, even though I could say to you, while I'm still alive, you know what? I forgive you the $100. You don't have to pay me back. You don't have to pay back the owner of the promissory note. Tom's out of luck. I could say that. But once I die, my heir, my child, cannot forgive that loan. You owe it to Tom, and now my heirs have nothing to say about the matter. Now that only works because I gave it to Tom on my deathbed, and then I died. Now, granted, if you say that the gift of a person on his deathbed is valid by Torah law without a kinyan, due to that reason, the heir cannot forgive the debt, as the debt was acquired by another. When I gave it to Tom on my deathbed, he acquired it. It's his debt now. My son has nothing to say about it. But if you say that the gift of a person on his deathbed is valid by rabbinic law, why is it that my heir, my son, cannot forgive the debt? And the Gemara replies, Rav Nachman maintains that although the gift is not effective by Torah law, nevertheless, the sages made it a halacha, with the force of Torah law, as I explained before. Rava says that Rav Nachman says with regard to a person on his deathbed who says, now here they use the word ploni or ploni bar ploni, right? And that sometimes translated as every man and sometimes translated as so-and-so, right? But sometimes I just say Reuven or Shimon, just make up a name. But the Aramaic, what they use is this ploni, right? Or ploni ben ploni. And they're just talking about so-and-so, some guy, okay? So we'll use the term that the Koran uses, so-and-so, right? So Rava says that Rav Nachman says, with regard to a person on his deathbed who says, so-and-so shall reside in this house, or so-and-so shall eat the fruit of this palm tree, he has said nothing. I didn't say, after I die, give my house to so-and-so, or I hereby right now on my deathbed, give my house to so-and-so. All I said was, so-and-so shall reside in this house, or so-and-so shall eat the fruit of this palm tree. Well, he has not said anything, as one cannot give that which is not tangible, such as the right to live in a property, or the right to consume fruit that has not yet grown. His statement is ineffective until he says, give this house to so-and-so, and he shall reside there. Or, give this palm tree to so-and-so, and he shall eat its fruit. And the Gemara asks, is this to say that Rav Nachman maintains that only a matter that can be conferred as a gift by a healthy person with an active acquisition, with a kinyan, can be conferred as a gift by a person on his deathbed by means of verbal instruction? But a matter that cannot be conferred as a gift by a healthy person cannot be conferred as a gift by a person on his deathbed? And consequently, a person on his deathbed cannot transfer ownership of an intangible right? Just as a healthy person cannot do so? Is that what we're saying? Right? So are we saying that, well, a healthy person cannot convey this intangible right? He can't say that, I'm giving so-and-so the right to live in my house. You can't do that. You can draw up a contract that he has, like he has a lease, blah, blah, blah. But just the simple, bare statement, he can live in the house, it's an intangible right. A healthy person cannot convey that, and a person on his deathbed cannot convey that. That's what it seems to say. But doesn't Rava say that Rav Nachman says, and now we're on page 148a, the second page is going to be short, where'd I go? But doesn't Rava say that Rav Nachman says, with regard to a person on his deathbed who says, give the loan owed to me to so-and-so, right? This loan that you owe me money, give it to Tom as a gift. Then the loan that is owed to him is acquired by so-and-so, right? Tom acquires that loan. And this, or the right to receive the repayment of that loan. And this is the law, despite the fact that this would not apply in the case of a healthy person, as one cannot transfer a loan to a third party in the absence of a promissory note. Before we were talking about, I sell Tom a promissory note, or I gift to Tom while on my deathbed the promissory note. Now we're saying I give you the right to collect a loan where there is no promissory note. Now normally you can't do that without a promissory note. So how is it that a person on his deathbed can do that? Does it seem that some people, gifts on deathbeds, are able to make transfers that wouldn't work at all in the case of a healthy person? And Rav Papa says, in this case, the law of transferring loans differs with regard to a person on his deathbed, since an heir inherits loans without a promissory note, and the sage is accorded the gift of a person on his deathbed, the halakhic status of an inheritance. So we don't compare the gifts of a healthy person to his friend to the gifts of a person on his deathbed to his friend, because the gifts of a person on his deathbed are not comparable to gifts of a healthy person. Rather, they are comparable to inheritance. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, said, a loan without a promissory note can be conferred as a gift by a healthy person. Who says you can't confer a loan as a gift if you're a healthy person? You can. And this is in accordance with that which Rav Huna says that Rav says, as Rav Huna says that Rav says, with regard to one who said to another, I have 100 dinars in your possession, give it to so-and-so. If this was stated in the presence of all three parties, the third party acquires the money without a kinyan and without the need for witnesses. but only in the case where the lender, the borrower, and the recipient of the gift of the loan are all standing in the same room. If it's a deathbed situation, we don't need all those conditions. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to one who gave a palm tree to one person and its fruit to another. What is the law? Did he reserve the place of the fruit on the tree for the second person in order to give him a tangible object, and therefore the second person acquires the fruit? Or did he not reserve it and the second person does not acquire the fruit? Now, if you say, I give a palm tree to Reuven and its fruit to Shimon, sounds simple, but it's not. Because if you say, I give all the fruit to Shimon, or I give the fruit to Shimon, right? Meaning he has the right to all the fruit. So what actually happened here? Are we saying that Reuven owns the tree, but Shimon gets all of the fruit and I retain nothing for myself? Actually, no. What we're saying is when I gave the tree, but I didn't give the fruit to the person who I'm giving to the tree, what I've actually given him is the trunk, right? We're talking about date palms here. What I've actually given him is the right to harvest the wood when this tree withers and dies. Until then, he doesn't really have anything. He just has that sort of survivor right of the trunk of the tree. The guy who gets the fruit, he has the right to keep getting the fruit. But what I did is I reserved the top of the tree for myself so that I could give the fruit to someone else. You wouldn't know that from a straightforward reading of this, but if you read the notes, you would see it. So that's why they're asking this question. If he gave a palm tree to one person and its fruit to another, what is the law? Did he reserve the place of the fruit, right? The place where fruit grows. It's like I'm actually reserving that for myself. Did he reserve the place of the fruit on the tree for the second person in order to give him a tangible object, and therefore the second person acquires the fruit with it, with the place of the fruit? Or did he not reserve it, and the second person actually doesn't acquire the fruit at all? And furthermore, if you say that giving the palm tree to one person and giving the fruit to another is not considered reserving the place of the fruit unless that is explicitly stipulated, then if he reserves the fruit for himself, stating that the tree is given to another except for its fruit, then what is the law? And Rava said that Rav Nachman said, even if you say that giving the palm tree to one person and its fruit to another is not considered reserving the place of the fruit for the second person, if he gave the palm tree to one person and reserved the fruit for himself, he also reserved the place of the fruit, meaning I kept everything of the tree except the trunk. And what is the reason for this distinction when I reserve the fruit for myself or when I give the fruit to a third person? What is the reason for this distinction? The reason is that anything that one reserves with regard to himself, he reserves generously. And therefore, he reserves for himself not only the fruit, but also the place of the fruit. And Rabbi Abba said to Rav Ashi, we learned the aforementioned statement of Rav Nachman with regard to the statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish concerning a different matter. As Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, also known as Reish Lakish, in the case of one who sells a house to another person and says to him, I am selling the house on the condition that the upper story of the house remains mine. Well, then the upper story remains mine. Now we're on 148b. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to the statement of Reish Lakish. If one sold a house, i.e. the lower story, to one person, and he stated that the upper story will be sold to a different person, then what is the law? Is this considered reserving additional rights for the second person apart from the upper story or not? What are we talking about here? When you're talking about reserving additional rights, isn't it just, it's a duplex? Okay, so there's a lower house and an upper house? No, because the lower house, right, let's say the lower house has the courtyard, and the upper house, the upper story, doesn't have a courtyard, but does the upper story have the right to build projections, like a terrace, out of the upper story that would cover, block the sun from reaching part of the courtyard below, right? So does he, like if you were selling your house, you say, I sell you the lower story, but I'm keeping the upper story for myself. Well, someone who reserves something for himself reserves generously. So he's not only reserving the upper story, he's reserving the upper story and the right to build projections out of the upper story. So the question is, if he sells the lower story to one person and the upper story to a different person, does that different person also get, along with the upper story, the right to extend projections out of it? What is the law? Is this considered reserving additional rights for the second person apart from the upper story or not? If you say that in the case where one sells his house to one and the upper story to another, his stipulation is not considered reserving rights for the second person. There is another dilemma. If one sold the house except for the upper story, reserving the upper story for himself, what is the law? Is this considered reserving additional rights for himself? And Rava said that Rav Nachman said, even if you say that where one sells the house to one person and the upper story to a different person, he is not considered to be reserving those rights of, the ability to extend projections. Nevertheless, if one keeps the upper story for himself, he is considered to be reserving the right to make those projections. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Zevid, who says that the reason the seller reserves additional rights is that if he wants to extend projections from the upper story into the space of the courtyard, he may do that. And the Gemara concludes, evidently, since he reserved the upper story, he also reserved the place of the projections. And here too, with regard to one who gave a palm tree to another and reserved the fruit for himself, since he said that the tree is given to another except for its fruit, he reserved the place of the fruit, right? In other words, the fruiting part of the tree for himself as well. New subject, and I am almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Mishna states that if a person on his deathbed granted all his property to others, but he reserved for himself any amount of land, this gift is valid even if he recovers from his deathbed. If he did not reserve for himself any amount of land, his gift is not valid if he recovers. Rav Yosef, meaning he gets to retract everything that he gave away and he keeps it. Rav Yosef Bar Minyumi says that Rav Nachman says, in the case of a person on his deathbed who wrote a deed granting all of his property to others, the manner in which he divided his property is examined. If it appears that he was intending to divide his entire estate among various recipients, then if he dies, all the recipients acquire their gifts. If he recovers, he can retract all the gifts in accordance with the ruling of our Mishnah. But if it appears that he was reconsidering the matter, vacillating, initially intending to give away only a portion of his property, and then reconsidering and redistributing the rest, then if he dies, all the recipients acquire their gifts. If he recovers, he can retract only the last gift, as the previous gifts were given with the intent to reserve part of the property for himself. If you give everything away but reserve something for yourself, then even if you get better, the gifts are valid. The recipients get it. But if you did that, and then you gave out the last bit, and then you recover, okay, well, the last bit you can take back. But the rest of it, those people got it because when you gave it to them, you did reserve something for yourself. Now the Gemara asks, but perhaps he was not reconsidering. Rather, he initially intended to transfer ownership of all of his property, and he was just considering to whom to give each portion, and then giving it. And the Gemara answers, the usual way of a person on his deathbed is to consider the matter carefully first, and only then start to confer his gifts. Therefore, if he pauses to consider in the interim, it appears that he did not initially intend to transfer ownership of his entire estate, and so if he gets better, the parts that he gave away initially are given. And the parts that he gave away last, maybe he could take that back if he left himself with nothing. That's what I've got for us today. Nina is leading a book club online, so I have to scan the comments myself rather than her passing me the questions. So bear with me while I scan. Jonathan, I found it interesting that you could be on your deathbed if you are not ill. Example, suicide. So it seems that deathbed is defined by how close the instructions are to death. If it is so, that we could learn out that a deathbed instruction without a kinyan is by Torah law, from the fact that this Achithophel, just prior to committing suicide, was considered to be on his deathbed. But in the end, we don't learn out that it is by Torah law from that episode in Scripture. So I'm not sure that we could say that a person, who's on the verge of committing suicide is also considered to be on his deathbed. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we learned that from that passage, but it's definitely a good shaila, right? It's a good difficulty and a good question. Jonathan also says, with respect to winds and seasons, I wonder if this was based on a farmer's almanac or data, or whether the weather was more superstitions. That's really interesting. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's more the farmer's almanac model, right? In the sense that, they kept records and they observed things over many years, and then maybe there was just this sense that it usually goes this way. Because it didn't seem, when they told us this thing about the winds, they weren't telling us that and it's rooted in Scripture according to such and such. Rather, it seemed to be an observation of, well, when the wind comes from that direction, usually it means such and such. Sharon, the second paragraph of the Shema speaks of the adherence to mitzvahs. That, in other words, if the nation adheres to the commandments, this influences the proper rains at the proper times. Are these smoke columns then influenced by the people's behaviors, or are they distinct, and how is that potentially resolved? I would say, Sharon, that they are saying, why would a good year come? Ultimately, right, the level of the people was at, here when Joshua first led the children of Israel into the land. And, over the next 400 years, it just dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. And you had wicked kings come who promoted avodah zarah, idolatry, not just in the castle, but throughout the kingdom. And so the spiritual level of the people dropped and dropped and dropped. And eventually, they lost the right to live in the promised land. And Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the first temple, and there was the exile. And then, there was a right of return, so to speak, when Ezra led the exiles back in the building of the second temple. And eventually the level dropped on drop. And by the time of the Roman war and destruction of the second temple, and we're still living in that exile. So there is this sense that even if we don't see individuals punished by God for their sins, and we often see that the wicked prosper, or that the innocent seem to suffer in this world. Nevertheless, there is, this idea that if the nation as a whole is doing well, or the nation as a whole is doing badly, then the nation becomes subject to reward, or the nation becomes subject to punishment. Now, this is a world in which God hides. So it's not like an easy to see quid pro quo. But there definitely did seem to be trends, right? And so this idea that, perhaps, and who can measure? Only God can measure. We don't know how many people are doing mitzvahs and how many people are doing aveiros, fulfilling commandments or sinning. But God sees all of that. And so maybe there is this sense, when the nation is doing well and it has a righteous leader and people are trending toward righteousness, that perhaps it's going to be a better weather coming the next year, and vice versa. But it's never, clear as day, and the math, so to speak, is obvious to us, because that's not the world we live in. Okay, and Marjorie, shalom from Georgia, where I just received a terrific email from the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival with venues, because, yes, Guns N' Moses will be playing at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, and so will my first movie, When Do We Eat, which played at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival 20 years ago. They're doing a little retrospective. So 2 Sal and Nina Litvak movies playing at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival at the beginning of next year. Okay, last question or comment. Jonathan, I've come to think of the land as another character in the story, especially in the situations where the Torah says the land will spit you out. So I interpreted the second paragraph as well. If you act poorly, the land will reject you and not be your partner. I think along the same lines of what I was saying. And we don't see it, just boom, boom, boom. So many people did so many sins, and so now you're out. But the trends clearly reveal that. And that is why I also say, and many people say, that, first of all, sadly, so many Jews in the world, like by far the majority, are disconnected from Torah Judaism. And it's so bad when you consider that, when the level that people drop, like whatever God's calculus was, maybe like it went from 100% to 90%, or from 90% to 80%. Very bad. But now it's like 90% of the Jews in the world are disconnected from Torah. Now, a lot of people would say, and I heard Rabbi David Aaron say this, but that's been the case for so long, so many generations, that you almost can't blame that there's just so many Jews that don't even know what it means to be Jewish, don't even know what the Torah says, don't know what the commandments are. And so they are likened to kidnapped babies, right? They're Jewish, but they don't know they're Jewish. They don't know what it means to be Jewish. They don't know what their obligations are. They don't even know that they're supposed to learn what their obligations are so they can fulfill them. Very bad state of affairs, but God is very kind and forgiving and acknowledges that. However, when, even at our low level, we dip even lower, we're in danger. And when we're at our low level and we rise, we become safer. And that's why, since we're already at a very low level, so many Jews don't even know what to do. The Jews that do know what to do, when we do our job, or when a woman who hasn't been lighting Shabbos candles on Friday starts to do that, massive impact. When a Jewish man that never put on tefillin puts on tefillin and starts to put on tefillin as regularly as he can. And when a person who's never learned Torah starts to learn Torah, it's such a big impact. And the Jewish nation is safer when Jews are fulfilling their obligations. And I would say the whole world is safer when human beings are fulfilling their obligations, right? Because not just the Jews have commandments, all human beings are obligated in the Noahide commandments, which include learning Torah. So, the more Torah that's being learned, the more tefillin that's being wrapped, and the more candles that are being lit, the more people are avoiding eating things that they shouldn't eat, and the more people are avoiding profanity and nudity and extramarital sex, etc. Anything that you do to be a more righteous person really increases the holiness and righteousness and safety in the world. I look forward to learning with you again tomorrow, Friday, God willing, at our regular Friday time, noon Pacific. And I'll mention again then, no class this Saturday night, because if you're in this part of the woods, we're having a Guns N' Moses screening at Chabad of Pasadena. It's on their website, Chabad Pasadena. There will be a screening of Guns N' Moses this Saturday night. But in the meantime, see you tomorrow, God willing, Friday, noon Pacific. Have a great night.